Good evening and welcome. The Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday Observance Committee and the Teaneck Library invite you to join us for the second presentation of our Black History Month series, The Black Freedom Struggle in the Early New Jersey, 1613 to 1860. My name is Shelley Washington. I'm a Virginian who resides in New Jersey, a committee member and your moderator. Before I introduce our presenter, viewers, audience, I should say, this evening you will have the opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. This evening, we will have the pleasure of meeting Dr. Christopher Matthews. Dr. Matthews is a historical archaeologist and a professor of anthropology at Mount Clair State University in New Jersey. His research interests are the archaeology of capitalism and race in the United States and the practice of community-based research. Dr. Matthews' work is focused on sites associated with slavery and freedom, and he has directed field projects in Maryland, Louisiana, New York, and New Jersey. He is an author. He is an author of a book titled An Archaeology of History and Tradition and the Archaeology of American Capitalism. He is also co-editor of several archaeological publications. This evening, Dr. Matthew will present his most recent, or I should say, his new book, A Struggle for Heritage, Archaeology and Civil Rights in a Long Island Community. It was published in 2020. This is a series of our Black History Month program. It is presented in partnership with the Martin Luther King Jr. Birthday Committee and the Teaneck Public Library, and we welcome you, Dr. Christopher Matthews. I have given the title of your book, a little about you, and with all that being said, what does it all entail?
Thank you, Shelley. It's a real honor to be here, and I'm thrilled to be able to share some of the work I do. And it's nice that you mentioned my book, but I'm actually going to talk about something else tonight just to bring it closer to home with New Jersey. And so I'm sorry if there was some miscommunication about that, but I'm going to be talking about the Black freedom struggle in early New Jersey from the beginning of the colonial period up to the end of the antebellum or the Civil War era. So what I'm gonna do is share my screen. So I have some slides I'm gonna show while I talk, and I just set that up.
Perfect.
And oh, hold on, I might need to unshare, and so I want to show the full picture. Nope, I'm sorry, I made a mistake.
It's okay.
Bear with me, friends. Gotta make this bigger. Hold on, I hope I can do that. Okay. I'm not sure I can. I used to be able to. Well, I don't want to delay us, so I can live without showing it that way. Now I've lost you guys. There you are.
Okay. Technology is wonderful.
Okay, there. Okay, I'm sure you can see my slides, but you can't see it as a slideshow. I guess sometimes I have two screens going and it makes it work better for like that. So I apologize for that, but you can see here title of the talk that I have for you guys tonight. Okay, so I have like text that I'll read, and I'll try to be not fully reading the whole time, so not just a talking head, but I'll do the best I can.
Thank you.
Knowledge of the history of slavery in the northern United States remains largely unknown outside of a small community of scholars and historically minded people. Indeed, even as awareness of northern slavery grew exponentially after the discovery of the New York African Burial Ground archaeological site in Manhattan 20 years ago, research on and public understanding of slavery as an essential aspect of colonial and early American life in the North remains poorly recognized and even less understood. Nowhere is this more the case than in northern New Jersey. Settled as part of the Dutch New Netherland colony, Bergen and other northern New Jersey counties developed a largely agricultural economy, producing surplus food and fuel for the urban center of New Amsterdam, later New York, the Caribbean, and the Atlantic world. Several historians have documented the development of the region and its consistent reliance on enslaved African and African American laborers. For more than 200 years, enslaved laborers cleared fields, built homes and outbuildings, planted and harvested crops, tended to farm animals, carted fertilizer and produce, cared for white children, and performed countless other tasks that enriched their masters and stabilized the settler society. Still, most people do not know their stories. Among all New Jersey counties, Bergen consistently had the highest number of enslaved people, who made up close to 20% of the county's total population throughout the 18th century and even into the early 19th century. One historian estimates that slaves made up 40% of Bergen's total labor force. Still, we don't know much about their story. This sense, I'm gonna have to do this way. Okay. This sense of place was captured by Peter Hassan Cleaver, who described what he saw while traveling the Passaic River in 1764. We appeared to have been suddenly transported to the Netherlands. The Dutch are settled throughout the fertile river valley. The roads are lined with fields of prosperous looking farms, in some cases hundreds of acres. They are able to maintain such large properties by the use of slaves. I saw dozens of them hoeing in the furrows, men, women, and children, often singing in a deep, mournful sounding way. This evocative scene depicts a situation where slavery was visible, common, and a basic foundation of the local community. I also ask you to consider this thought from historian Graham Russell Hodges. The history of Bergen County allows us to consider what an American future in which virtually none of the white citizenry opposed slavery or favored Black freedoms, what would have been like. The investment and commitment to slavery in Bergen and other counties in northern New Jersey was not the norm for the American North. Rather, this region, especially in the 18th and early 19th century, may have been one of the most closely approaching, maybe the one most closely approaching what Ira Berlin termed a slave society. In contrast to a society of slaves where slavery was practiced, but was one among many forms of labor, such as indentured servitude, wage labor, and family labor, a slave society was concentrated on the permanent and inherited bonded labor. Moreover, in slave societies, slavery was sustained by law, economy, politics, and a wide latitude granted to slave owner authority, including the right to punish or kill their slave property without recourse. At the same time, this is a story about Africans and African Americans, so we cannot focus solely on how they were abused and exploited by white settlers. As with all people, enslaved and free people of color sought self-determination and struggled to preserve the freedoms they earned. Hodges provides a useful overview of the way freedom was envisioned by these African American New Jerseyans. Freedom meant several things: personal freedom to exercise rights, to form Black institutions, create Black leadership, to work for wages, avenge past wrongs, and to protect and extend liberty through military service. Rather than express their identity within the paternalism of the Dutch masters, Blacks relied on an ideology drawn from African heritages and from the crucible of slavery and freedom. Slavery and freedom exist through the negotiation of power. On one side, there was a power of the colony, the state, the masters, and a racist white community which sought to limit the freedom of Black people. On the other side were Africans and African Americans who found power in resistance, retribution, and their own forms of community. As Hodges suggests, these drew from multiple sources, some ancient and African, and others recent and American. Tonight, I want to share a handful of these stories of this sort of African and African American agency, starting with the man most people consider to be the first non-Indigenous resident of our region. The history of New Jersey starts with the settlement of New Netherland, which was originally what is now Manhattan. The story of the first settler sets the stage. Captain Thijs Mossel sailed the vessel Young Tobias in the Hudson River Harbor in 1613. Mossel stayed a few weeks to trade with Native Americans, and when he left, a member of his crew, Juan Rodriguez, remained. Rodriguez was an African descended man. Because of his supposed disloyalty, perhaps the reason he was left behind, Mosul later referred to Rodriguez as a black rascal. Rodriguez is said to have remained in New Netherland and to have married and fathered children with women from the Rockaway Native American nation. Of course, many settlers eventually joined Rodriguez as newcomers in New Netherland. The number of settlers grew rapidly after the Dutch West India Company was contracted to build a settlement in Manhattan in 1621. 5 years later, in 1626, the company purchased 16 black people from a Portuguese pirate ship. These men and women were the first enslaved Africans in the New Netherland colony. Following these initial captives, came hundreds more enslaved people whose labor and skill were essential to the survival of the New Amsterdam colony. In 1644, Governor Kieft concluded that Negroes would accomplish more work from their masters at less expense than Dutch farm servants who must be bribed by a great deal of money and promises in order to work. In 1650, slavery was praised by West India Company Director Peter Stuyvesant, who noted that these Negro slaves have offered a great relief in the purchase of provisions for the garrison. We have a great need of a few slaves in order to truck them for provisions. From the very beginning, there was a consistent effort by African descended people to fight for their rights and freedoms. Hodges describes that 5 blacks traveled in 1635 from New Amsterdam to Holland to seek a settlement on their salaries, and in 1639, the company paid them for building the fort. In 1644, can't do that. In 1644, 11 enslaved black men petitioned the Council for New Netherland for their freedom. They argued that they be released from their servitude and be made free, especially as they had been in the service of the Honorable Company here for 19 years and long since had been promised their freedom. The petitioners in 1644 were Paulo Angola, Big Manuel, Little Manuel, Manuel de Garrett, Simon Congo, Anthony Portuguese, Peter Santomé, Jan Francisco, Little Anthony, and Jan Fort Orange. And you can see the image here of a New York City landmark, which is Washington Square Park, showing the location of the property that those formerly enslaved individuals temporarily owned. They happened to lose that because the nature of their situation was that they could not pass property on to their children, and thus it reverted back to the Dutch colony after they passed. Still, most Africans suffered. Still, most Africans suffered under the lash of slavery in the colonial era. Several laws ensured their subordination, such as the 1682 statute that forbids sale or purchase of goods from slaves, specifically as a reference to slave theft. In 1694, a 1694 edict restricted the use of guns or the private ownership of dogs or pigs by slaves. Another ruling defined the punishments of slaves accused of murder as execution or livestock theft as repayment and whipping. These laws indicate that slaves fought against their captivity by running away, stealing from their masters, and perhaps threatening people with firearms and murder. Sadly, instances of retaliation by whites for these acts are also recorded. With what amounted to an absolute white supremacy backed by law and power, slavery in New Jersey grew quickly over the first decades of the 18th century. The number of enslaved persons in New Jersey grew from a likely undercount of 120 in 1680 to 1,500 by 715 to almost 4,000 in 1738, who were at that time 9% of the total colonial population. Enslaved men and women, however, were prized for their skill. Hodges described them as jacks of all trades in the house and the field. They made it possible for New Jersey farmers to grow wheat, corn, rye, as well as keep orchards and meadowlands. In Dutch communities, slaves herded cattle, pigs, and horses. Other chores included barrel making, carting, shoemaking, carpentry, and preparing meats and poultry and fish for cooking. The labor of enslaved women is also captured in this advertisement from 1734. To be sold, a young Negro woman about 20 years old. She does all sorts of housework. She can brew, bake, boil, roast, soap, wash, iron, and starch, and is a good dairy woman. She can card and spin at the wheel, cotton, linen, and woolen. She has another good property, that she neither drinks rum nor smokes tobacco, and she is a strong and healthy wench. She can speak no other language but English. She has had smallpox in Barbados when a child. As Hodges concludes, the only difference between a skilled free white laborer and an enslaved black worker at this time was the degree of their degree of liberty. It should not be a surprise then that with the growing number of enslaved people, that we also see a greater evidence of collective resistance, such as continuing evidence of escapes, arson, and theft. An important form of resistance is also found in the cultivation of an alternative culture among the enslaved communities, the clearest expression of which was found in an annual Pinkster Celebrations. Sorry. Described as the celebration of the holy wind that resurrected Christ, Pinkster promoted an ecstatic release of energy and faith, including moments when either master or slave could become the mouthpiece of God. African descended people seized the moment, but mostly to gather in ways that were forbidden in their day-to-day lives. At the same time, Pinkster is known as a mass celebration that often featured heavy drinking, gambling, and much interracial comradeship. Graham Hodges cites one description from 1737, which states that Africans from the Guinea coast were adept at drums and stringed instruments. Bangers, rattles, and fiddles were common. Performance of the fiddle was very different from European methods, with a highly percussive style in which the musician plucked the bow energetically. Pinkster songs, with their emphasis on role reversal, complemented African songs and dances of derision. Pinkster created an orchestral style akin to the music of the African festival. As Fishman, another historian, George Fishman, explains, these Negro assemblages undoubtedly served a valuable purpose of morale boosting and welding together. They could also no doubt be the occasion for the exchanging of views on their oppression that weighed down on all and served as a basis for a possible concerted action to advance towards the freedom goal. Moving ahead to the time of the American Revolution, we learn about other impressive examples of African-American agency and resistance. In general, the war created a new context for enslaved people to seek freedom. For one, but Virginia Governor Dunmore and New York Governor Clinton announced that any servant or slave who escaped to the British would be granted their freedom. As a result, hundreds of enslaved New Jerseyans fled their masters to join the British forces in New York. Critical of Clinton's offer, one New Jersey poet wrote, "A proclamation of late he send to thieves and rogues who are his only friends. Those he invites, all color he attacks, but deference he pays to Ethiopian blacks." And you can see here an image of Dunmore's Ethiopian regiment. I mean, an image created after the fact. From the start of this conflict in 1775, the number of runaway slave ads increased to record over 100 slave and another 100 indentured New Jersey related runaways. Some of these men and women escaped as the British passed through northern New Jersey in the latter part of 1776, during which over 50 slaves from Bergen and other counties fled to the British to gain their freedom, contributing to what was taken to be a wave of revolt. Moreover, after the Patriot retreat, Tories and fugitive blacks sacked the homes of Patriots in Schralenberg in Bergen County and raided the Bergen County townships of Gloucester, Tenafly, and Tappan to secure cattle and forage. One of these self-emancipated men was Titus, who ran away from his master in Monmouth County, and as is documented in this ad from the Pennsylvania Gazette, offering a reward for his return. Titus was never captured, but rather returned to New Jersey as Colonel Tye, serving in the British Army at the Battle of Monmouth in 1779. Over the next year, Colonel Tye led multiple raiding parties consisting of both black and white soldiers from Staten Island and into Monmouth County. And these raids included sacking and burning Patriot homes, as well as the capture and freeing of many slaves. He also captured or killed Patriot officers and militiamen. Tye led dozens of black men, Queensrangers, and other refugees who came to be known as a motley band as their exploits were reported in the New York newspapers. Another well-known black loyalist was Major Tom Ward, who led raiders based at the blockhouses at Fort Lee and Bergen Neck. His group was credited with facilitating the escape of 29 enslaved persons from Bergen in June of 1780. Their method was to flee with the interracial guerrilla bands sent out to forage in the Bergen County and set slaves free. These escapes these escapees could leave through ferry landings where blockhouses manned by refugees and Black soldiers guarded access to the city. Ward's Blacks terrorized the Bergen countryside and helped other slaves escape for the next 2 years. Ward's overall success at maintaining control over the blockhouses in the Bergen Neck region even earned him a laudatory visit from Prince William Henry, later King William IV. After the war, Black loyalists were rightly concerned about the future. George Washington saw these former slaves as stolen property and sought to return them to their masters. However, General Carleton, who led British New York, disagreed and honored the original offer of freedom in exchange for their service. More than 150 escapees, known today as Black loyalists, from Bergen County and elsewhere in northern New Jersey, later traveled from New York to Nova Scotia, and some then went to Sierra Leone in Africa to live as free people. After the Patriot victory, New Jersey followed two sectional paths. In South Jersey, where Quaker anti-slavery influence was pronounced, the number of enslaved persons dramatically declined, while in northern New Jersey, it was quite the opposite. There, slaves consistently made up more than 10% of the population of every county, and the number of enslaved persons grew after the war, more than 20% overall. Still, as the number of free people statewide increased, we also unfortunately see new forms of public anti-Black racism. Edward Long's History of Jamaica, which portrayed enslaved Africans as mere violent savages, or almanacs that continually portrayed Africans as heathens and devilish apes, sold well in New Jersey. In 1797, a pamphlet titled The Devil or the New Jersey Dance, a horrid relation of facts which took place a few weeks ago in New Jersey, published at the request of many people, told the story of a murderous Black fiddler and gives us perhaps an alternative origin of the idea of the Jersey Devil. In 1794, an agent for Dutch investors named Theophile Casanova advanced further racist rhetoric towards free Blacks in his published travel journal, where he noted that free Negroes are quarrelsome, intemperate, lazy, and dishonest. Their children are still worse, without restraint or education. You do not see 1 out of 100 that makes good use of his freedom, or that can make a comfortable living, own a cow or a horse. They are worse off than when they were slaves. Obviously, a statement that every single African and African-descended person would disagree with. This anti-Black rhetoric, especially when aimed at free Blacks, played a significant role in delaying state action to end slavery in New Jersey, which was the last northern state to pass a formal act of abolition in 1804. This act established that all children born to enslaved mothers after July 4th, 1804, would be free once they had served their masters for a term, if a male until the age of 25 years, and if a female until the age of 21 years. This calculation appeased slave owners who feared that setting slaves free would damage their way of life. Instead, the children of enslaved mothers would be required to labor through some of the most productive years in much the same way as if they remained enslaved. Notably, the 1804 Act did not free anyone. It was also provided nothing to these young men and women upon the completion of their indenture, as was the norm for white servants. In addition, New Jersey, unlike every other state in the North, never amended the law to free those born before the act went into effect. As such, slavery did not formally end in New Jersey until the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified in 1865. Because legal slavery in New Jersey did not officially end until well into the 19th century, most whites in the state assumed any person of color was enslaved and thus could be a possible runaway if they were out of place. For example, Sam and Tom, two free African Americans, narrowly escaped re-enslavement when they were captured as possible runaways in 1785. They were jailed, but then set free after they produced certificates of their freedom. Historian George Fishman rightly asks, what if they did not have a certificate at hand? Like Sam and Tom, free African Americans were required to demonstrate their freedom to anyone who asked and faced the threat of losing their freedom if accused of crime, escape, or because of the legislative will of the state's leaders. An 1821 court decision, in fact, declared that in New Jersey, all Black men were prima facie slaves. And it was not until 1836 that the New Jersey courts abandoned this position, but they did not address the surviving statutes, which continued to restrict slaves from testifying against whites, mandated a 10 p.m. curfew for Blacks, prohibited disorderly conduct for both slaves and free Blacks, and barred free Blacks from owning firearms or begging in public. The experience of freedom in the 19th century was limited for African Americans in New Jersey due to other factors as well. 2 race riots in Newark certainly would have put people ill at ease. An 1811 letter to Newark's Sentinel of Freedom newspaper reported that a member of the local committee charged with quelling the noisy and riotous Blacks was knocked down. The letter spurred a group of white Newarkers to punish those responsible by making open war on the Black community, destroying the home of one freedman and damaging another. In the melee of revenge, whites destroyed furniture and beds and looted several other homes. In 1834, after a sermon titled "The Sin of Slavery" by William Weeks, a white pastor, a number of white men charged the altar and captured a Black man who stood with Weeks to confine him in the town jail. Subsequently, a mob of 200 to 300 white men assembled outside of the church, proceeded to smash its windows, destroy the pulpit, and break the majority of the pews. Violence quickly spread to other areas of Newark where white mobs targeted Black businesses. Many whites in New Jersey were also sympathetic to the South, mostly because of their own business and property interests connected to the cotton industry that was thriving there. State leaders strongly supported the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, including Senator Jacob Miller, who extolled it and the institution of slavery, referring to the South, referring to the South, quote, where the slave contentedly labors in the cotton fields for his master. Miller applauded slavery as a key part of the best system of laws ever devised by man. Given this sentiment, it's not surprising that New Jersey was known to many as the Georgia of the North, and nor that the state legislature failed to ratify the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments after the Civil War. Even liberals failed to support Black freedom, as is illustrated in their interest in colonization. In this scheme, whites proposed to send free Blacks from New Jersey to Africa, where they would be Christian civilizing agents among native African people. The impetus for colonization was a false conclusion that the situation for African Americans in New Jersey was too difficult. Everything connected with their condition, including their color, is against them. So sending them to the land of their ancestors was seen as the best and kindest solution. Almost all Black New Jerseyans rejected colonization. People of color organized their opposition at public rallies, the first being in 1817, just a year after this idea was put forward. In 1830, New Jersey native Reverend Peter Williams Jr. stated, "We are natives of this country. We ask only to be treated as well as foreigners. Not a few of our fathers suffered and bled to purchase its independence. We ask only to be treated as well as those who fought against it. We have toiled to cultivate it and to raise it to its present prosperous condition. We ask only to share equal privileges with those who came from distant lands, to employ the fruits of our labor. To enjoy the fruits of our labor. Let these moderate requests be granted, and we need not go to Africa or anywhere else to be improved or to be happy." Among the most eloquent anti-colonizationists was Reverend Samuel Cornish, a founding editor of Freedom's Journal in New York City, America's first Black-run newspaper. In 1839, Cornish wrote that colonizationists were swindling up the souls and drying up the liberality, benevolence, and piety of Jerseymen. Black anti-colonization activism was successful in that between 1820 and 1853, only 24 people actually left the state. Rejecting colonization, African Americans in New Jersey instead put down roots and created communities and institutions to support their well-being. One of the first of these was known as Skunk Hollow, a community of about 75 individuals living near the New Jersey-New York border in what is now Palisades Interstate Park. Skunk Hollow was founded by Jack Ernest in 1806. By 1880, the community grew to 75 people living in 13 different households, after which it declined and was altogether gone by 1910. Another small community formed in Paramus along Dunker Hook Road, where 7 households consisting of 45 individuals lived in 1860 and continued to live there into the early part of the 20th century. More than 30 free Blacks were listed as farmers in Monmouth County as early as 1784, and these included Samuel Lawrence, who owned 100 acres and 5 cows. And probably the wealthiest African American in this early era was a man named Mingo, whose property was valued at 685 pounds in 1802. Most of this estate consisted of 586 pounds of notes and bonds against sundry people. In other words, people owed him money. Mingo was most certainly a creditor to other African Americans who may have seized this opportunity to secure a foothold in the local economy. African Americans also established urban communities such as the African Shore and Patterson, as well as in sections of Newark, Hackensack, and Elizabeth. Several all or mostly Black towns also formed in South Jersey, such as Lawnside, Springtown, Gouldtown, and Timbuktu. The mixed race community also grew up near Hopewell in Somerset County. Sylvia Dubois, I'm not sure how it's pronounced, is the most well-known of these residents. She was born into slavery, though she emancipated herself after an altercation with her mistress. Later in life, she established and ran a nightclub in Hopewell. The club was an attraction for free people of color, slaves, and whites who came for the alcohol, the dancing, cockfights, fox chases, and prize fights. She recalled her own dancing expertise in which she could, quote, strike a heel or two with equal ease and go through the numbers as nimble as a witch. Dubois' tavern burned down in 1840 under suspicious circumstances, after which she rebuilt a wigwam-style hut on the land and for a couple of decades made a living raising hogs. She then moved to live with her daughter near the summit of Sourland Mountain, where she was living when her life story was recorded by a local doctor. And this picture was taken at that time. That would be Sylvia with her daughter. Black communities also found refuge in religion. Most white churches denied African American membership, including Quakers, who were otherwise their most active allies. Dutch Reformed churches accepted free Blacks as members, but they were forced to sit in Negro pews. In lieu of joining white churches, therefore, then African Americans crafted their own religious communities. Itinerant African American pastors have been documented to travel and preach in New Jersey. One was John Gia, who was born in Nigeria but captured and enslaved in New York. He claimed an angel taught him to read the Bible in Dutch and English. As a preacher, Gia drew hundreds of African Americans to his services. The meetings were based loosely on Presbyterian and Methodist love feast. Gia wrote that he preached a theology of rebirth by linking to the story of Lazarus with aspirations of an emerging free Black congregation. African Americans also took steps towards creating their own Christian denominations in this period. The most prominent was the African Methodist Episcopal Church, which was founded by Richard Allen in Philadelphia in 1787. But by 1860, there were 32 AME churches in New Jersey. Some African Americans in Newark also turned to a Sunday school for African Americans into a site for more formal academic learning. Over 200 people of all ages enrolled. In 1816, Newark's Sentinel of Freedom reported that the little time they employ every Sabbath in the school furnishes their principal opportunity, and yet their improvement has been extraordinary. Judging from the facts and observations, it would seem to be vain anymore to oppose the cultivation of the mind of the colored people on the ground of inferiority of intellect. The school acquired public funding in 1836 and remained open until 1909. Known later as Mr. Baxter's School, it was a key institution in Newark's early American history. African-American New Jerseyans created other outlets for social organizing, such as Black-owned newspapers. Samuel Cornish's The Colored American, which I mentioned earlier, was founded in 1837. Inspired by its success, other Black writers followed suit, including Alfred Gibbs Campbell, who published The Alarm Bell out of Paterson. Paterson's Black community appears to have been particularly well organized. A powerful anti-slavery broadside produced by the citizens of Paterson in 1841 stated, "Men of both parties who feel that slavery in New Jersey is wrong are afraid to act in relation to it, lest it jeopardize the interests of their own party in the South. How can we allow mere questions of pecuniary advantage or of party ascendancy to overshadow the great question of human rights?" Political action among African Americans blossomed in the 1830s with the formation of the statewide New Jersey Anti-Slavery Society. The society secured Black dignity and rights in America, settled constitutional and biblical questions about human rights, abolished the Negro seat in churches, and helped Black students gain an education. A convention in 1849 of the Anti-Slavery Society at Trenton's Mount Zion Church demanded African citizenship and voting rights. Dr. John S. Rock, spoke there with passion. Rock was a self-trained doctor who had been denied admission to medical school because he was Black. He turned to dentistry and later studied law and became the first African American to be admitted to the bar of the US Supreme Court. He clarified that African Americans were not human being enough to vote, but they were for paying taxes and obeying the laws. He rejected the conception that African Americans were degraded, challenging that you shut every avenue of elevation and then complain about degradation. What else can be expected when you are looked upon as things and treated worse than unthinking animals? He concluded his speech with this: "The country a man is born in is his country, and the humanity that would oppress a colored man for a white man's sake is not a humanity for us. And the man that will refuse to assist suffering humanity on account of color is undeserving the name of man. Our design in speaking frankly is not to upbraid you, but to show you our maltreatment and ask that you ameliorate our condition by giving us our rights." With these powerful words, I just want to turn now to a conclusion for my presentation. These stories and historical facts show that African American New Jerseyans are well documented in the state's early history. These stories need to be made more widely available to the public. We need a wider recognition of the African American contributions of labor, patriotism, social and political organization, community leadership, and the arts that made the settlement and culture of New Jersey what it is today. Each of these contributions was made in the face of a majority in the state who either ignored their struggle or actively despised and or exploited them. Thus, the ability of African Americans to establish their own relationships, allies, communities, towns, and neighborhoods, create and lead their own churches and schools, print and distribute their own newspapers, cultivate their own artistic and cultural traditions, and persistently defend their humanity and liberty, as well as those of their enslaved brethren in the South, and to do all of this in the face of a vicious racism at home, should leave us all in awe of their collective resilience and power. Thank you.
Wow. Dr. Matthews, thank you. That was a host of information, clearly pointing the differences of Northern slavery and Southern slavery. Before I open the floor for questions, here is what I'd like to know if my understanding is correct. Okay, the timeline, 1600. So 1600, the new Dutch, or the Dutch more or less introduced slavery.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
1700s, it is increased through the Portuguese, from being slaves being sold from the Portuguese.
So the first enslaved Africans in the Dutch colony of New Netherlands were purchased from the Portuguese, but the Portuguese were never in this region as settlers. So that's the Portuguese connection, and that's why some of those names were Portuguese sounding because some of those people were perhaps had been born in Portugal as enslaved Africans, or had become part of a Portuguese cultural line because of the Portuguese slave trade.
That was going to be my next question.
Okay.
And so then we moved on into the 1800s, where Blacks were flourishing, yet there was resistance, of course, from white society. So
Right.
that is our timeline and how things move. That is quite a difference from what Southern slaves experienced.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, for our audience and viewers, you may type your questions into, you will see at the lower portion of your screens, it will say chat. Please, the floor is now open. You may ask Dr. Matthews or make your comments at this time, and you will have to type them to me and I will relay them to him. But Dr. Matthews, that was very interesting. Very interesting. And I also had
there's a Q&A section too. So there's chat and Q&A. So if you're looking.
Oh, yes. You're absolutely correct. Let me get myself to Q&A and see. One moment. Yes, and there are 2 questions in the Q&A. This is an anonymous attendee. Dr. Matthews will likely get to this, but if not, does this history explain why New Jersey remains so racially divided, town by town and within towns?
That's an excellent question. And I'm sure some of what I spoke about does have something to do with that. But I tend to think that what happened is actually in a later period than when I was talking about. Around the end of the 19th century is when a lot of the towns we know started to become a little bit more rigid in their boundaries. I happen to live in Montclair, and so I know the story of Montclair was founded in 1868 as a way of separating from Bloomfield, and then another town also separated from Bloomfield. And this is all related to sort of a home rule ideology of making like, we want to take care of our small community ourselves, which has divided New Jersey. I can't remember the numbers now, but apparently someone might know, and it would be great if you could share this, something like 600 school districts in New Jersey, or maybe it's 300. It's an enormous number. And if you compare that to other parts of the country where school districts are countywide, they have a much better community base to try and put groups who live in different places and come from different backgrounds together, whereas it seems that our separation was very intentionally created by creating small municipalities that were trying to achieve essentially a homogeneous and also kind of class homogeneity, class and race homogeneity in the way these communities were going to be formed in perpetuity, because undoing those town lines and school district lines and all that is a very difficult prospect.
So in essence, you're saying the end of the 19th century, the towns became more rigid, and pretty much it's based upon the size of the municipality.
Well, they kept getting smaller and smaller so that they could be more internally homogenous along class and race lines. Usually separation was, we have the ability because of our wealth to separate, right? Poor folks don't tend to have that capacity to create their own town the way wealthier folks do.
Second question. Were the African Americans who were granted indentured servitude between 1600 and 1700, even 1800s, where did they come from? I am hoping that the Q&A are also able to actually hear your reply, because there is an area here where I can type the answer.
I think they can.
Okay, I pray so.
Because yes. Otherwise, it's just you and me talking to each other.
and I should be typing. Okay. All right. Go ahead.
We got a yes.
I'm sorry. I'll repeat. Should I repeat the question?
Yes, please. I can't.
Were the African Americans who were granted indentured servitude between 16 to 1700s, even 1800s, where did they come from?
That's a great question, and it's not a question I have a good answer for. I gather you're asking what part of Africa or what point of origin outside of New Jersey before they came here did they come from? And I'm not entirely sure. I did mention there were some the original enslaved group was from a Portuguese ship, but whether they were from where on the African coast they would have been taken from, I'm not entirely sure. There are a number of databases about slave carrying vessels that with a lot of data about where they came from and where they went to. And so I'm not sure, I've never looked at those for New Jersey specifically, which is a shortcoming on my part, but because I'm focused on what's happened here. Unless you're asking a different question, which would be, how did they get their freedom? I'm not sure I know the answer to what their original point of origin was. So I apologize for not having a good answer.
Well, I think we all know that the original was from Africa. Now,
Right.
if they went via Europe, and then and I would assume so because the Portuguese were actually selling slaves here. So
Right.
okay.
And then there's also a path through the Caribbean.
Right, but they still
part of
came
Bergen
from
County.
Africa to the Caribbean.
Yeah. Well, part of Bergen County it used to be known as New Barbados because it was after it transferred from the Dutch to the English, a bunch of English planters from Barbados settled in Bergen County along the Hackensack River, and then renamed it as New Barbados because they were very much interested in using that land in New Jersey to provide provisions to send to the plantations in Barbados. And
if I'm not mistaken, they were one of the last settlements, correct?
Which was
the Barbados, the New Barbados from Bergen County.
I'm not so sure it was. I think some of New Barbados was definitely initial settlements, but it wasn't the first in Bergen County. It's just the territory of New Barbados was obtained through suspect treaties with Native Americans who granted the lands, which would mean they were the first settlers.
We have another question. Ms. Yarmo would like to know, New Jersey was the Georgia of the North. Do you have any information about lynchings in New Jersey during the time you spoke about? I was curious.
I do not, and that's an excellent question, and I am certain in my heart that we can find that, but someone has asked me about this before. And in the research I've seen, there's been a lot of violence against people of African descent, but it doesn't fall under the context of a lynching involved, because it usually falls under the context of either violence by masters against their slave or violence by the community against enslaved people who were convicted of a crime, which is slightly one step to the side of a lynching, which is extra legal, if you know what I mean. So, but if anyone else knows anything about that, I know that there are some people who've asked me about that before.
She has also just made a statement that there were more than 400 New Jersey school districts.
Thank you.
She said
it's a very large number.
Yes. Our next question. What information do you have about slavery in Bergen County? There is an African-American cemetery on Broad Avenue and Lakeview in Leonia. Do you have any information about Do you have any information about that? And is the African-American cemetery in Alpine from Skunk Hollow? FYI, there are 77 town school districts in New Jersey in the countrywide vocational school. Let me reread her question. What information do you have about slavery in Bergen County? There is an African-American cemetery on Broad Avenue and Lakeview in Leonia. Do you have any information about that? And is the African-American cemetery in Alpine from Skunk Hollow?
That cemetery in Alpine might be the proximity. I mean, they're in the same part of the same area. I've just never heard of a cemetery officially associated with Skunk Hollow, but whether that is whether they go together, that could be. We do have names of a lot of people who lived at Skunk Hollow. So if we know some of the names of that cemetery and we can compare that to the names of people who lived at Skunk Hollow, then we can say yes or no, it's a different community. I'm not sure I know the cemetery in Leonia. I do know of a cemetery that there's a cemetery along the bend of one of the rivers in Bergen County that has both a Native American and an African American component to it, which has been recently, people have been talking about it in the cultural heritage sector because there's been interest in preserving it, but also making it accessible for the public to use, to recognize it as a cemetery, but also to sort of have it as a place you could have a walking path through. And there's a lot of resistance to that, saying this is a cemetery. You wouldn't put a sidewalk through the middle of somebody else's cemetery, so you shouldn't do it in this one. I'm not sure if that's the one you're speaking about. What I do know is that there are a number of undocumented cemeteries across the state, because it's often the case that communities of color, like at Skunk Hollow and the one I also mentioned in Paramus at Dunkerhook, those communities disappear. The people eventually stop living there, and most likely there are burials associated with this community in some place that we don't know where they are. I'm very familiar with Dunkerhook because I'm involved in a project that's in doing archaeology there. And we have a rough idea where the church was, it's gone. And if there were burials, we don't know where they would be. So it's one of our top priorities is to try and figure out if there were burials there and how we can document them to see if they're still there. Currently, it's both a mix of private property and public property associated with something called Dunkerhook Park, which is part of Bergen County's park system.
Well, Dr. Matthews, you're in your bio, and when it states that here, your work is focused on sites associated with slavery and freedom, and he has directed field projects in Maryland, Louisiana, New York, and New Jersey. What sites in New Jersey, and what did that entail?
The New Jersey work is relatively new. So the Dunkerhook site that I just talked about is something that's happening right now. I did a non-excavation project in the city of Orange, looking at the impact of Interstate 280 on the Black and Italian communities who were displaced and what happened to them after the fact. And that was a project where we didn't do the archaeology because the highway cuts through the city and essentially dug up everything already. So we creatively called it a reverse archaeology because we can't dig. So we did it backwards, but oftentimes the work I do involves a lot of archival research, which is what generated the essay that supports my presentation today, but as well as oral history to talk to people about their own memories. And if you're talking about construction of an interstate, there's people who used to live in a place where that interstate is now, and capturing those stories before those elders pass is part of my mission as an academic. But I've also, there is a potential archaeological project in very South New Jersey a place called Marshalltown, which was a Black community in the late 19th and early 20th century. And these were migrants from the South, people who were probably born into slavery, then who moved to Southern New Jersey to pursue a life of freedom, because even though it was after the end of the Civil War and they were free people in Maryland or on the Eastern Shore, it still wasn't the opportunities weren't as great and the safety wasn't as obvious as it was in Southern New Jersey. So there's a lot of work that could be done in that area. But mostly my work that's completed has been over in Long Island, where I did a number of projects related to the book that you mentioned that just came out, as well as a couple of historic houses that were the homes of where enslaved people lived. And we were able to dig in locations where we think they would have had spaces of their own. And we found a lot of very interesting things, which I'd be happy to talk about, but it gets pretty detailed pretty quickly. So,
do you have a copy of the book on hand where I could just show?
Oh, sure. I must.
Let us see the cover of your.
Yeah. There.
Oh, well.
Is it backwards?
No, it is not. A struggle for heritage. Okay.
The struggle for heritage. So this is based on a community in a town called Setauket, which is on the North Shore of Long Island, and they are mixed heritage, Native American and African American, and they've lived there therefore forever. And the archaeology we did there was to document sites and collect oral histories related to this community because they're struggling to survive, because the cost of living there is, reaching beyond their capacity. And I've worked with, the folks on this cover are like the grandparents of the people who live there now. And so I've worked with those younger folks who are sort of the voices that we're trying to kind of amplify, especially in the face of a historical story in Setauket, which is all about the Revolutionary War and provides no support for anybody who doesn't fall into sort of mainstream patriotic narratives. And so this book is an effort to document a heritage that struggles to be heard, which is how we get that title.
And it was published in 2020, so it can be purchased wherever a person or however a person purchases their book.
Right, it's the University Press of Florida, yeah, it's up on Amazon. You can find it.
Thank you. No, that's quite interesting, particularly for here in the North, because you often hear African Americans here will say that they have Native American, heritage as well. It's the cross, so maybe of interest to many.
Right.
If there are any other questions, audience, viewers? If not, we are going to again thank you, Dr. Matthews. Most enlightening. Thank you for the time and the effort and the education that you are putting out in the universe regarding. And I know we're Jersey, but it's still history, and many people are born here, and so it is their history. Like I said, I'm from Virginia, so I have the opposite. I have the hardcore slavery of lynchings and all. But that was most exciting. Thank you very much for your presentation. Beautifully done. And I do not have any other questions coming in, so we will not take any more of your time. But again, the committee, the Martin Luther King Birthday Junior Observance Committee and the Teaneck Libraries, we thank you so very much. Also, Dr. Matthews, if you care to, and viewers, or I should say audience, next Thursday will be our part 3 of the series, and that will be the Cultural Equity in Practice, the Barnes Foundation. It will be presented by Kimberly Camp, and the president of Gallery Marie in New Jersey and curator for New Vision Camden. It's a lecturer. Lecturer Camp will tell the story of a true cultural warrior on the front lines of democracy and education, and how race and class challenge our ideas about great art. So again, we bid you good night, and we thank you. We are very grateful for your time.
Thank you for the opportunity to share the work.
Yes, and please stay in touch with us.
I will.
Also, everyone, please remember to double up on your mask, social distance, and wash your hands. Please be safe and pray for your families and pray for each other. Have a good evening, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Good night.